The Bible reading is from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they do not understand one another's speech." Kaneko lungu jua sokonesie chiwecheto chawanduwo kuti akapikanaga tuine ninjakwe. Lungu ni jua pilingenye wandu wa chilambo cha basi walesile kutawa nsindowo. Sindowo wapul that'll do.
Okay, good morning, my friends. I can't believe you guys let me do this. Okay. Years ago, one of my cousins was being baptized, and we were talking, my cousins and I, about what we thought heaven would be like. And I said I was so excited that in heaven I could finally learn all the languages that had ever existed. An older relative overheard this conversation and severely chastised me for making heaven in my own image. And I said, "What, are we all going to be speaking English?" And then they said, "No, we'll be speaking the one heavenly tongue." And then I said, "Now, I have to warn you, I'm the troublemaker in the family, okay?" I said, "Of course, Arabic." Okay, the Tower of Babel. Now, some of you, like me, have grown up in churches and are very familiar with this story from Sunday school. Maybe it went something like this. After the fall, in which humans tried to become like God by eating from the apple and got punished with death and exile, the humans tried again. They decided to build a tower all the way to God so that they could become like God themselves. They were proud and full of hubris, whatever that means. And what they did was sinful. So God came down to stop their schemes and mix their languages and scatter them as punishment. But I think there's a lot of problems with this version of the story, with interpreting the story like this. A few weeks ago, Glenn took us through a second look at the fall, and we're going to be doing something similar here. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you about the story of the Tower of Babel is that it isn't about the Tower of Babel. Yeah. Right, let's look again, right? Verse 4, "And they said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower, and the top is in the sky.' Verse 5, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built." Verse 8, "And the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city." Well, the tower's not here. So, if the text doesn't even explicitly say that people stopped building the tower at the end, it would be weird to think that a tower to heaven was the whole reason God did all these things. It looks like from here that the tower isn't the point. Maybe it's just part of the city. And anyway, I don't think our ancestors believed that we could literally build a tower to heaven like any more than we do. Like, they weren't dumb. Like, you have to remember that heavens and sky are the same word in Hebrew. To build something with its top in the sky is a common metaphor. We have other examples of it. Like, they may as well have said skyscraper. We don't think our buildings literally scrape the sky. But if the humans weren't trying to build a tower to God, then what did they do wrong? Were they doing anything wrong? What's wrong with hanging out and building a city together? And if they weren't doing anything wrong, why did God punish them? Was God punishing them? There's audience participation later, Lydia. Just hold on to your socks. So you've come across a story deep in the bowels of the Tanakh. That's like the Old Testament. And you're like, I don't know what this means. So what do you do first? Here's my excellent cheating guide, right? The real trick to finding out on what on earth an early Old Testament story is probably about is to read the first line and then the last line. So we're going to do that, okay? Verse 1, and all the world was one of language and one of speech. Literally, one of lip and one of word. And then verse 9, because of this, its name is Babel, for there the Lord mixed the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them all over the face of the earth. Okay, so this is a story of how languages got mixed, and maybe also a story about how the people of the world got scattered, and also connected to the naming of the city of Babel, that is Babylon. In terms of genre, by the way, stories like this in Genesis are very much like our English equivalent would be How the Cat Got Its Tail, which means that the idea of a cat like somehow not having a tail and then having a tail doesn't really make sense in a historical sense. It's kind of using mythology logic rather than literal logic. So just kind of keep that in mind and don't be like, does that mean there was one person for every single language that existed? Let's not ask that, okay? And this is a really interesting story historically too. The creation story and the flood story are both really common myths for their time and place, that is, ancient Mesopotamia. In some ways, Genesis' stories about creation and the flood are really conscious responses to the alternative narratives that the people around them were telling. Like, instead of the flood being like, I don't know, some gods had a nap and then had a fight or whatever, maybe it's a direct intervention for the good of humanity. This story, however, the city of Babel, there's nothing else quite like it. The ancient Israelites, they were telling a story to themselves that was for some reason not relevant to other nations and cultures the way it was relevant. What's going on here? Earlier in this series, we already talked about how these stories were likely written down around the time of the Babylonian exile. The original language of Babylon, kind of 3,500 BC, was Akkadian, which, by the way, looked like this. Yeah, my ancient language teacher was like, this language will give you reading glasses. Don't learn it. Anyway, in Akkadian, Babel, or Babylon, means gate of God, or gate of the gods. So, if our Genesis 11 story was really about building a tower to God to become like God, then this name would be a really fitting name, right? The story would all end like, and this is why Babylon is called Gate of the Gods, because here humans try to build a gate to the gods. But it doesn't, right? It says, and this is why Babylon was called Mix, because here God mixed us. And here God did mix them. This is where the Israelites were carried off to live in shanty towns and intermarry with other peoples. The Israelites were dispersed here. They were made diaspora. I like the audacity of naming your own captor's capital city Diaspora Town. When I was in high school, the girls wouldn't refer to people's romantic interests by their names. They would call them nicknames like Coffee Boy or Clarinet Kid or Budget Harry Styles or James 2. There's a sense of meaning giving that the story is doing to Babylon for the exiled Israelites that kind of subverts the narrative that Babylon is trying to create for itself. Babylon's yeah, we're the gate of the gods. And the Israelites are like, yeah, that place where we hung around for a while, kind of confusingly. Some of your translations will say that God confused the languages, or muddled the languages, or even babbled the languages. But these translations are actually improperly negatively connotated. The word mix here, babal, is literally to mix, like cooking ingredients. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, we have a bunch of verses that are like, babal the flour with oil for the grain offering. We don't write a cake recipe like, confuse the flour with 2 egg whites. Confuse implies something has gone wrong, that there's wires across that they need to be uncrossed. But we want the eggs and flour to mix. A good cake is a well-mixed cake. Okay. If it's not obvious enough already, I did my undergraduate degree in linguistics. A key figure in linguistics, this is a linguistics lecture now, a key figure in linguistics is this guy called Worf. Benjamin Lee Worf started his career in 1920 as a linguist. It says here, as a fire prevention engineer. Worf was super good at his job. And what he was noticing was that a lot of fires were started by language. Wait for it. One factory Worf visited dealt with barrels of oil. One room of full barrels of oil, and then they'd go and empty it into whatever they were doing, and then they'd put the empty barrels in the other room, right? The workers, they were careful and conscientious with the full barrels of oil. They'd handle them carefully, keep them well away from flames. After all, they're full of oil, right? They're flammable. But when handling the empty barrels, they relaxed, They even hung out in the room of empty barrels to take smokos. But here's the thing, right? These empty barrels are full of fumes, right? Aerosolized fuel in a gas form, way more flammable than the liquid oil. But because the workers thought of these barrels as empty and these barrels as full, they're like, these barrels are empty. They thought empty of oil, not full of incredibly flammable fumes. So they didn't realize the risk they were taking because of how they named the barrels in their head. Another example is when a factory needed to dry out a bunch of hanging sheets of product. It was a long corridor with an opening at one end and it was closed at the other. And so they put a fan at this end to blow air over the product so that it would dry out, right? However, putting the fan at the closed end meant that it got hotter faster and was an electrical fire risk, right? And Worf was like, you've put the fan here because you think, fans blow, so I need to put the fan here so it blows over the product and then out the window. But fans also suck. You could put the fan at the entrance and then it will suck air over the product and then out, and then you wouldn't have an electrical fire risk anymore. Worf developed this idea that our language affects the way that we think. If our language likes talking in a certain way, then we favor thinking in that way. If our language has trouble saying something, then we also have trouble picturing that in our minds. Language kind of cheese wires how we think. It's not impossible to understand a concept that you don't have a word for, but it's really hard. I don't know if you've ever tried to explain the concept of prestige to a non-English speaker, or guanxi to a non-Chinese speaker, or a year ago I brought this rock up the front and tried to explain shalom in Hebrew really badly for a while. Oh, thank you. Okay, we're ready for our audience participation now, Lydia, okay? Raise your hand if you know what the term woke means. Yeah, you're all groaning. Okay. Keep your hand up if you're confident you could give me a definition of woke. Oh yeah, Guy, what's your definition? Awake. Thank you, Guy. Jack? Enlightened. Okay. Lydia? Self-righteous. Elise is offended. Go on, Elise.
Being aware of the way that we speak about things and the way that it is injustice.
Yeah, that's really hard, right? Yeah. So this is the thing. This is a thing called a cultural rich point, which is a word that, like, yeah, we all know what this means, right? And then as soon as you start trying to define it to each other, you're like, no, that's not what woke means. Woke means, like, even if you both agreed beforehand, that you're like, you both obviously know what woke means, it doesn't, it's like, this is actually deeper and more complex, but because we have a word for it, we just use the word the whole time, and we don't realize what a weirdly nuanced concept we've encapsulated, right? So just for fun, I wrote a definition of woke. To demonstrate an awareness of intersectional oppression, or someone who virtue signals left-wing ideals, sometimes derisively used to indicate this awareness is shallow, facetious, or performative. For example, Evangeline's sermon sounds woke, but they haven't considered how their depiction of other languages as tools of defamiliarization reinforces the exoticization of the other through a lens that fails to be appropriately decolonial. Exactly, right? Like, even when you try and explain it, it just gets worse. Another really fascinating area of how language affects how we think is when it comes to time. To grossly oversimplify, in English, we tend to think of time as now, after now, and before now. But some languages think of time as this morning, before last sunset, after lunch, and after tomorrow's lunch. When we tell stories in English, the entire story happens in the past. The humans built a tower, and then God came down, and then God said blah, 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 right? In ancient Hebrew, the present tense moves along with each sentence, like each verb is the next second on the clock. The people are building a tower. God is coming down to see what they built. Now God is saying blah, blah, blah. Yeah, right? So my point is, a different language means a different way of seeing the world. If we can barely understand how we use the word woke, like, you can see how it gets hard as soon as you get into your second or third language. Some thinkers in the 1900s, called Russian formalists, you don't have to remember this, they coined the term defamiliarization. It's the idea that seeing a familiar thing in an unfamiliar, unexpected way causes you to pay attention to that thing for the first time again. Different languages allow us to see the world again. Octave, to write poetry with words that are so different they don't even have the same figurative language concepts. Like, have you ever read poetry in your second language? Here, listen to this, right? Haba nil bana lil banim, nishrafa lishrafa. You can hear the poetry in these lines, right? You can hear the little consonants. You know, like someone crafted this. Do you want to know what it says? Come, let us bake bricks and burn them thoroughly. Bet that's the first time you paid that much attention to those lines. You know what I think God was doing in the story of Babel, in mixing our language? I think He was defamiliarizing us. The diversity of humanity, the familiar in the unexpected. Seeing someone so different from you, and that yet they are also you. Now we are paying attention to people for God in time again. Sometimes I think we look to the tops of towers for God, when really we should have been looking at the neighbor laying bricks next to us. I have a friend who she's been a believer her whole life, but she doesn't go to any churches because she doesn't feel safe there anywhere. But one time I was talking to her about something, and I don't even remember. I said something like, yeah, like, and there was this little pause, and then she said, I love God. And we were looking each other right in the eyes. Like, if I could capture that moment and bring it here, that would just be my whole sermon. Like, someone, like, so far away from the we're meant to kind of sit in awe of like the person we worshipped. Humanity is one big city. First, who built this city? Are they being paid fair wages? Who gets to live at the top? What's the class mobility like in this mega metropolis? But also because not everyone wants to live in a city, and not every city is a place to thrive for every type of person. I'm glad God scattered us around so we could find our own ways of being and doing and creating, because there's more than one way to be made in the image of God. And I love going to other churches and seeing how they do things differently. And I love meeting believers thriving in unexpected places like daisies on the sidewalk. And I love learning other languages and stumbling over the consonants all fuzzy in my mouth. We're going to apply this concept of defamiliarization to our relationship with God now. I'm going to teach you a new name for God. Well, an old name, a very old one, but it's okay. I've picked an easy one for you, okay? Ready? Adonai Hadonim. Adonai Hadonim. Great. Tell the person next to you. Adonai Hadonim. We translate this name in English as Lord of Lords. But I don't want you to remember it by the English meaning. I want you to remember it by the way that it sounds in your mouth. Adonai Hadonim. May the weirdness and newness of this name be for you a symbol of the newness and weirdness of God. The familiar made unfamiliar name of the one who made their unfamiliar self familiar in Joshua ben Joseph, now called Jesus. God's picture of our future often has us at least metaphorically returning to the garden, but it doesn't have us returning to speaking one language. At Pentecost, the Holy Spirit didn't give the believers the ability to all understand one language, but rather to speak every language. And I think that's because every language has a way of seeing God that can only be expressed in that language. And every person has a way of seeing God that only they will be able to fully understand. This is from Revelation. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out in a loud voice. Now imagine this in every language that ever existed simultaneously. Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Just think of the polyrhythms, like Adonai Hadonim. Let's pray. Adonai Hadonim. You have given me my own way to see you, and you have given everyone their own way to see you. We look at you like mirrors and glass. We look for you in each other so that we can see you again from a different angle. We would like to be in awe of you and of how weird and large and new and old you are. But we don't want to manufacture that emotion in ourselves. We want to be forced to feel it by the way that you reveal yourself to us. And even when you don't, we trust that there's always more of you to discover, like there's always more to discover about each other. Adonai Hadonim. Amen.